Hi everyone, this is Rachna Singh, editor, The Wise Owl, and it is my pleasure today to invite Eliot Duncan, a poet and an acclaimed writer. Eliot graduated from the Iowa Writers Workshop, where he was a Truman Capote Fellow. His debut novel, Ponyboy, was critically acclaimed and became the National Book Award nominee. So, Eliot, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about your book, Ponyboy. Let's dive into the interview straight away. Yeah? Thank you so much for taking time out to talk to the Wise Owl about your book. And you've won a lot of accolades and critical acclaim for the Ponyboy. Right? It's been nominated for the National Book Award also. So please tell us, for the benefit of our viewers, please tell us about the genesis of the novel. How did you start writing it? What inspired you to write it? All of that.
Yeah, I didn't really know what I was doing when I started writing it. I didn't really have a full concept that I was writing a book. I think I was just sort of collecting sort of fragments of my life. And at a certain point, I had enough pages that I thought, oh, maybe this is like a book-like thing. So I think I wasn't setting out directly to write a novel, but over time, it just sort of naturally became that.
Okay. Sounds interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I recollect you saying somewhere that poetry is your first love, right?
Yes, I would like. Yeah, I would like to be a poet, but I've always sort of lovingly got the feedback that my prose are stronger. But I tend to write from poetry first. So I'll write a poem and then sort of extend it into prose. And, if you think about it, like poetry and prose aren't so different. Of course, there are differences, but, prose are just sentences. And like the punctuation and the chapters or sections of a book, even new pages, can be like line breaks. So I just sort of think about it like that.
So what really attracts you to poetry, What made you gravitate towards poetry as a genre?
I think it's the immediacy of poetry. I think you have more freedom. Like there's less continuity. The form itself is I think more immediate. And so when I'm just like going about my day, experiencing the world, there's this closeness and proximity that poetry that poetry has that's really attractive to me.
And then what made you switch gears and write a novel instead of, say, a poetry collection or some such thing?
I think it was because I was writing at some point. I had poems, and then I also had a lot of prose. I had a lot of letters and interviews with historical figures. And at some point I started just writing prose. I can't tell you exactly when that was, but I sort of just started doing it. And then my manuscript had, a significant amount of prose as well as poetry. And I figured out that I could actually take the poems themselves and like sort of bend them into paragraphs instead of stanzas.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, because free verse is like an accepted form of poetry, and free verse is a bit like prose. And in your book, especially, what I found was that your novel had, the lyrical grace of poetry also, and the enjambments, all of those spaces. So that was a different way of writing, but I definitely liked it. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. I'm glad it worked. Yeah.
So now what I found very intriguing about your novel, it obviously the themes that the novel spans is substance abuse is there, then the experience of being a trans is there, all those, and you have also focused on the underbelly of addiction. You don't make it sound cool. It's tedious, it's traumatic. So what made you focus on that, and what made you focus on this negative aspect of I shouldn't say maybe negative aspect, probably the honest, the true picture of what addiction is like.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it was important for me to present a narrative that sort of interjected cinematic and romanticized depictions of addiction. I think oftentimes it's sort of given in this way that, like, yeah, it's hard and it's tough, but it has this sort of shimmer to it that makes it a little attractive. The cinematic swells a lot of addiction narratives, and I think it was, I didn't realize this at the time, but I think now retrospectively, I think it's important that Ponyboy stands as an interjection to that, to say that actually active addiction is just a monotonous hell, and that, the narrative itself, I think, gets a bit repetitive and boring as a way to mimic the sort of like colossal misery and just schedule that it is to be in active addiction. Yes. And I think it was just important to have that experience interjected into, a lot of the representation that we see of active addiction, and to just present it as like, this monotonous hell I'm talking about, but one that you can recover from.
Yeah.
It's not a life sentence. If you want to change, if you want to do something different, that's totally possible.
Yeah, so that's a very positive message that your book leaves. It talks about the hell of addiction, all of that, but it also sort of holds out a surety for the reader, a sort of a positive, lookout that if you want to get out of it, if you want to recover, then it is definitely possible. Mm-hmm. So, which is something I really like about your book.
Yeah, thank you. And also that, like, that recovery process doesn't have to be one way, right? Like, we see it's sort of complicated in Ponyboy's life, how he gets to recovery, and that it oftentimes takes many attempts to get through.
Yes,
yes,
right. Mm-hmm. So that's something which should connect with the younger generation. And I think it, like I said before, it's a very positive message that it gives out to the younger generation. Not necessarily younger, I'm probably just saying younger generation. It could, span anyone in any generation. So because in the slightly older people, most of the time addiction happens because it's a medical issue. They start off taking medicine for some disease or some physical issues, and then it sort of, becomes an addiction.
Yeah, and addiction can affect everybody, across the board, it can affect anybody.
Yes, that's right. So, okay, your protagonist goes through the high as well as the low of addiction, then the trauma of overdose, right? Before he limps back to recovery and a realization of his true self, the person he is. Now, I would like to believe that your protagonist is pushed into addiction because he's unable to admit to and embrace his true self. So, in a manner of speaking, the themes become inextricably connected, interwoven. So, could you please throw light on the thought process that went into melding these themes, or was it a spontaneous thing, or was it just the spontaneous thought process that you narrated, or was it a conscious thing that you did?
Well, I didn't really think about them as themes, to be totally frank with you. I didn't think about it as transness and addiction are themes that this novel will explore. I was just writing from the things that I was obsessed with, the things that were really present for me. And I think, it can be difficult with trans narratives because trans people in the States at least make up like less than 1% of the population. So oftentimes we have to validate our lives and our existence. And, I just sort of wanted to present a trans narrative that's reflective of the very human experience that it is to be a trans person, and to offer that as just facts. Like, some people are trans and that's it, and that books are studies of human consciousness, and we need as many varied consciousnesses represented in literature. And so, like, Ponyboy's consciousness happens to intersect with addiction and being trans. and that those things can be understood as linked, but a lot of people are addicts and a lot of people are trans and some people are both, and that Ponyboy happens to be a character who has both of those experiences. And sure, like some of his using and drinking is informed by his inability to accept himself as a trans man.
Yeah.
But the two things aren't explicitly linked. I think that Ponyboy would have been, using drugs and alcohol regardless of his gender, right? That like this is just some way that he was born, and he just came out this way, and that's how it is. So it was important for me to interject just sort of like a simplicity and a frankness that like transness and addiction don't need to be sort of sensationalized narratives.
Yes.
That this is actually just as simple as his human experience.
Yes, that's right. So books are indeed, like you said, studies about your consciousness, your human experience, melding that human experience into a narrative. And it would be wrong for anybody to, read it as a silo, like this is about a culture, or this is about a gender, or this is about transness, or this is about addiction. So it is the natural melding of experiences, and it actually depends on what the author wants to write. And invariably what happens is that it is the experience that the author has, had in his life. Because I've seen most writers, a part of them emerges in their books.
Mm-hmm.
So you tend to write yourself. I think you said somewhere that I've also written myself into the world, or I wanted to write myself into the world, which I thought was very, very relevant, because even then when you said that, I thought it was a very relevant thing that you had said, because I think with all of us writers, we want a part of us to, emerge in the narrative that we are, writing. Isn't that so? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think that all sort of writing is built on the perceptions and nuances and details of the writer's life and the writer's mind. And of course, like these things can be abstracted and channeled through characters or place or plot or structure. But for me, it's all informed by my senses, my lived experiences, the things that I find exciting, the things that move me, that all comes through in my writing. So yeah, I think, and I mean, it's sort of a bigger philosophical question of like, what is fiction? Like, of course we can obscure our lived experience and project it into fictional narratives. But the thing that I find interesting as being like a first person, really voicey sort of writer is that like everything is filtered through the voice. The voice is actually the plot. The whole drive of the book relies on the voice. I know that's not the case for every writer, but for me, the voice shapes the narrative. Like the narrative comes from the voice; it doesn't precede it, and that voice is, inevitably shaped by.
I recollect you saying that a novel is about human experience and consciousness, and although your book may be about a trans experience, you do not want a niche readership. Obviously, no writer wants a niche readership. So, considering your book has been nominated for the National Book Award, clearly your book has been accepted by the global readership, So how does that make you feel? Does that make you feel good? Or what is your reaction to it? What is your response to it?
I mean, it's kind of none of my business, right? Like my business is the writing, and to like leave it all on the page, write things that I feel good about and that I find interesting, and then to try to not be attached to the outcomes of that. And so any sort of like the nomination, I'm so excited about it. It's really affirming. It's a beautiful thing. I'm very happy for it. At the same time, I'm aware that it's really none of my business, and that in the way that like my priority and my sort of alignment is just to continue writing things that I feel really excited about and that I feel like reflects something that's important to me. And that, writing to me is like, spirit moving through someone. So if I can be armed with like the craft skills and the vocabulary and the discipline to articulate spirit as it moves through me, that's what I'm in charge of. That's my business. So I try and just focus on those things and leave the rest, up just something else, because it's a great outcome, but I can't live my life attached to the outcome of my work. Then I wouldn't make my work, right? And you have you have agents who know publishing. You have your publisher who they're like specifically trained to know these things and to work on these things, and that's not my job, right? So I leave it up to other people and just try and focus on the writing itself. And also that this idea that spirit has no market. Like the things that are through me aren't necessarily directly tied to a price, right? Like I don't know. It's, to me, it remains a mysterious, precious thing, and very happy for the nomination. But it also, I feel like I can't focus on it too much,
So that's a very philosophical way of looking at things, because most writers are very, very attached to the outcome. They're more interested in the outcome, and perhaps in the initial novels they are not, but eventually they get caught up in that, the commercial movement of the book. And so it is the sales figures that become more important to them rather than the actual book that they're writing. The job of the writer is just to write, get his story out there, But a lot of writers I have seen do, are very much invested in the outcome. So it's such a pleasure to, talk to someone who has made that demarcation that my job is to write well, to hone my craft, and it is the publisher's job to do the rest, which is a very positive. I feel that perhaps most of the writers follow this path, we probably will have a lot more good literature coming out into the world,
I hope so. Yeah. I hope so. Yeah. It's also the place I'm writing from, I don't have a lot of examples of books that match my identity markers exactly. So it sort of feels like anything goes. It's the space is wide open in the way that to focus on the things that are actually moving me and staying honest and clear about how I'm attached to spirit as it moves through me. And, it's a more peaceful way to go about it, I guess,
Yes, absolutely. I agree. Totally. I agree with that. So, okay. So the next question I have for you is that what I found very intriguing in your book is the two distinct narrative styles in your novel. The first half of the narrative focuses on the addiction of the protagonist, and the narrative writing style to match that is very metaphorical, a little abstract. In the second half of the narrative, the style becomes more simple, more minimalistic. So I really like that about that book, your book. It really connected with me. And because the second narrative that you have used, the narrative style that you have used, it reflects the chaos in the protagonist's life also, and then slowly how he limps back, how he recovers from that chaos. So the narrative style that you have used sort of echoes what is actually going through the protagonist's world, his movement through the world. So that I thought was a very interesting way of, moving the narrative style in your book, which I really liked about it. So tell me, was it a conscious juxtaposition of different narrative styles, or it just came to you naturally because you were expressing the experience of the character at that point in time?
Yeah.
So how did that happen?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you. I think the thing is that intuitively, it feels important for me as a writer to not have books be about something, but for the text itself to embody that experience. So that's exactly, I'm really glad that came through in your reading of Ponyboy, because I wanted the, first third to a half of the book where Ponyboy is using drugs and alcohol to be totally destabilizing and sort of ungrounded. Like he's free falling, there's like a groundlessness to it.
Yes.
And then as he moves through recovery, there becomes a sharpness and a clarity and a simplicity to the prose. And I just wanted the prose themselves to mimic the lived experience of the character. And that just feels like the only way I can write it. But yeah, I'm glad that came through, because it feels really present. And in my writing now, I still prioritize that as a concept, that like the prose themselves represent the experience. Like the language is the event, the language is the consciousness. It's not about an experience. The language is the experience.
Yeah. It's reflected in the language, your experiences. So that comes through very well. And another thing I read somewhere was that your book has been called a Bildungs roman by critics. So do you think that is a correct application of that, word to your narrative?
Sure, it's a beautiful word. I'm happy. It means it's like a German word for coming of age story, coming of age novel. Yes, I like it. Let's go for it.
Yeah, because that's exactly what is happening to your character. No, it's like a movement, like a spiritual quest, you could say, or you could call it just a movement. And from addiction to recovery. So obviously, it is a coming of age novel in that sense of the word.
Yeah, and I think it's also the story of transsexuality, because the ending chapter is 0, and we follow Ponyboy through this like subterranean experience, going through -3, -2, -1, and the last chapter is 0, where he sort of gets to a ground level, right? Because before he was living as a creature of the night, totally drenched and consumed with his addictions and his chaos and his inability to connect and have strong relationships with people. And at the end, we see this sort of like, I don't want to give too much away, but we see this sober acceptance of who he is and his life. I mean, complicated sobriety, not a simple one, which is chapter 0. So it's like him emerging, which also is a coming of age thing, right? But I think it's like maybe a little bit of a different twist on the coming of age story.
Yeah, probably. Yes, you're right. So we have a lot of viewers and readers who are also upcoming writers and poets. So is there anything you would like to say to them about how to hone the craft of writing, or about how to become a good writer? Any tips, any pointers?
I think it's just really important to find the things that deeply move you, whatever they are. If that's a book or a specific author or one poem or a film or a YouTube video of a live performance, whatever or a painting or, a specific item of clothing, to like orient your life around the things that deeply resonate with you, because, life itself is a creative process that we get to sort of be decisive about what we have in our lives and what we don't. And I think for any sort of creative process, it's just really crucial to find the things that physiologically move you, and to live within them. Like if you have a favorite author, drench yourself in their work. If you have like a filmmaker who you really like, or a photographer who you really like, look at their work often. Like keep these things inside of you so that you can build momentum in your own work, and think about your work as a conversation within a lineage. So, one thing that I felt really strongly was I had this sort of irreverence for people being like, you should read this or you should read that. I mean, I didn't study literature. I'm not well read in the canonical sense, but I fiercely created my own canon and found the work that I needed to find to move me into my creative life. And I think if you can do that, your writing becomes liberated and it becomes free, because you're not writing within other people's context. You've like forged your own context of what matters to you and the writers that make you excited to be alive. And if you can write within that and address them in your work, like as if your work is a letter to the writers you love, that's really powerful. I think that was the key thing for me that changed my process. And then also to think about, any sort of creative endeavor that you do, to to not be too precious about it. You know, you can have a lot of reverence for your creative project, of course, but also to remember that, like, at the end of the day, it's not that deep, and that we're just humans trying to make sense of the world, and that, you know, it takes many attempts, it takes many tries, and it's good that it takes time and effort. You know, it's good that it's not a simple, straightforward process, because if it was, there'd be less space for, you know, saying, I don't know, and for spirit to enter, and for, you know, things to appear to you on the way. Like, it's good that it's a trying process, and that shouldn't deter you, but should ignite you to, like, you know, join the ride and just go for it. Because you can't wait for permission, you know, you can't wait for someone to validate your interests, or validate your stories, or validate your voice. I think it's more about moving into this place of, like, I've found the voices that move me, and I'm going to write to them, because that's my canon, that's my life force. And maybe your canon are your friends, right? Maybe your canon is one writer that you found that showed you that you could also do it, you know, and whoever that is, whatever that is, to just stay aligned in that. Like, I, for example, read Chelsea Girls when I was, I think, 20 years old, by Eileen Miles. And it changed my life, because I was like, oh, right. Like, this is a similar experience that I'm having reflected in a published book. So it gave me a sense of momentum and excitement about writing. And so I had one chapter called Light Warrior. It's the beginning of the book. And I tore it out and I framed it on my wall, you know, and I looked at it every day, because that was like a significant signifier to me that I could also write, that I could also do it. And I wasn't conscious of it at the time. It was just sort of the things I was intuitively doing. But if you can find the things that deeply resonate with you, I feel like you can do anything.
Yeah. So that's great advice to all upcoming writers and poets, right? So before we wrap up the interview, Eliot, could you tell us if you're working on any project right now, any book you're writing, a novel or a poetry collection?
Yeah, I have a couple poems that are being published in March in the relaunch of the Erotic Review in London. I also have a couple poems published in the amazing literary journal called Tissue Mag, which is based out of London also. I also am working on a second novel, which is about hopefully it's not about, but embodies the spiritual condition that people call bipolar disorder. So I have a couple things, you know, going on. We'll see what happens. Like I said, I'm just gonna try and follow spirit as it moves through me, and see what happens.
Yeah, so that sounds really interesting. So thank you, Eliot. Thank you so much for taking time out to talk to us. And thank you about talking about your creative process. And you are very young now, so I'm hoping there's a long literary career ahead of you, and you come up with a whole lot of books which win a lot of accolades and critical acclaim.
Oh, thank you so much for saying that, and thank you for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Right. Thank you, Eliot. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.